As we move into the heart of the afternoon session, we'll move from more of a policy and research to practical applications and actual projects. We've heard how advanced air mobility can be transformative to our transportation and our land use infrastructure. As we prepare the Tampa Bay region for this transformation, we're watching other metropolitan regions with active projects to collect best practices and lessons learned from their experiences. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Jacques Coulon from the City of Orlando. Mr. Coulon has had the pleasure of working with the City of Orlando since 2015. He currently leads the city's efforts on preparing for emerging transportation technologies such as advanced air mobility and connected and autonomous vehicles. And he works on a variety of transportation efforts, including the city's planned Lake Highland Alden Road realignment project and Edgewater Drive Complete Streets project. In his current role with the city's transportation department, Jacques also serves as the lead for transportation-focused issues and items for all major proposed developments within the city. Jacques is a proud graduate of the University of Central Florida, where he earned a bachelor's degree in public administration and a master's degree in urban and regional planning. Jacques, we thank you for being here today.
Okay, well, good afternoon. Thanks for hanging out with us and staying after lunch. I'm with the City of Orlando, and we've been working on our advanced air mobility planning efforts for a couple years now. I did the same thing. I kept wanting to look up here, but there's the monitor right there. And really, for us, and should be a bit of a, it should be a bit of a reminder for everybody here, but when we look at advanced air mobility at the city, we're really, in our mind, we're looking at eVTOL aircraft, both passengers and cargo at fairly low altitudes, up to 150 miles on a single charge. So both those, might be 15 miles, multiple trips, or those longer flights, maxing at 150, 200 miles an hour. And we really think that it is not just a single vertiport connecting Tampa to Orlando, one vertiport in each location, but really in the long run, a network of vertiports, whether it's rooftops, garages, in an urban setting, to really connect the whole Central Florida region and pass that to other areas such as Tampa and farther afield. So, our Future Ready Master Plan, our advanced air mobility work falls under our Future Ready Master Plan, which is great because this Future Ready Master Plan was done in coordination with our community. So we had a series of months-long community engagement and in these 7 key priority areas. And under mobility, one of the strategies that came out of this, again, working with the community, this plan went to our city council. So we have a lot of buy-in from our council and our mayor. One of the strategies was for the city to develop a plan to engage with the private sector. A lot of this is being driven by the private sector in eVTOL takeoff and landing to connect our activity centers in the city and come up with a plan really focused on that air taxi model. We see that as being one of the earlier entrants into Central Florida, and come up with a plan on how we responsibly connect Orlando to our surrounding neighborhoods. So the plan really is to position the city with additional future-ready options for transportation. It's not that we are going to build a vertiport right now, and I'll get into why we feel we shouldn't be doing that right now, but how do we support the ecosystem? How do we help companies in the investments they're making bring that to Central Florida? So there's a lot of reasons why it's important for the city to be involved. Get questions every now and then of, there's an affordable housing crisis, there's traffic on I-4, there's all these different things that the city has to handle. Why are we looking at advanced air mobility? And a big part of that is being part of the discussion, like all of you here, being part of that early part of the discussion ensures that we are able to help move that discussion and the decisions and policies in a way that helps serve our community, that we get the best results we can for the city of Orlando. Nobody knows the city, our residents, and our needs as much as we do. Also, we are constantly looking for additional mobility options for our residents. We see this as a really great way to further linkage with our community, as well as the broader community partners such as Tampa. We want to make sure that equity is considered, not only who gets to fly in the aircraft, but the positives and potential negatives that come out of the placement of vertiports. And really, this is regional in nature. Like I said before, it's not one vertiport in the city of Orlando where you go up, you do a circle, and come down. You're going to go somewhere. So we need to be part of that discussion and help drive the location of where that somewhere is or where people are coming in from. So there's a lot of risks, and this is something that I know my leadership really wanted to understand. Okay, what if we don't plan? What are some of those risks? So some of the risks are up here, and not being prepared for if somebody does come into our community and want to put in a vertiport, if we're not prepared to really understand what are those safety concerns, what do we have to get our fire department or our airports to understand from a safety concern. Privacy comes up a lot. It came up a lot with drones. You know, is it my backyard when it's 2 feet off the ground, 10 feet, 100 feet, 1,000 feet? Infrastructure, as was mentioned earlier today, there's going to be a lot of electrification, and we want to make sure that as we're thinking through projects as a city and as a region, we're really starting to think through what does electrification mean of our aviation system. Also, we don't want to be at a point where we just get one operator comes in and says, hey, we want to put a vertiport right there, and we have to just pick up and react right away. We have certain state requirements to respond to applications for development, and we want to make sure we have as many answers before that application comes in as possible. Also, that community acceptance or community engagement piece is really key. While the FAA has a very big, I'd say, research, policy, and education arm, that community engagement really comes in first and foremost at the city and county level, particularly when there is a specific project or a specific location. And again, we don't want the first time our community ever hears about AAM is when there's a vertiport going in right next to their neighborhood. We want to make sure that they understand that this is something that we have been looking at, that we understand a lot of what those considerations are. Also, we don't want to just be told what to do by the state. Or by the federal government. We want to be part of that conversation because we want those rules, policies, regulations to make sense for the city of Orlando. And not being a part of that conversation, you're not able to have that type of influence on the discussion. Also, if we don't plan for this, then we are not providing that support and the information that our city leaders need. Our city leaders serve on things like the Florida League of Cities, National League of Cities, different panels with our aviation authority, they do a lot of things already in the aviation space and for local governments. And as a staff to them, I have to make sure that we are providing them the information and really the details they need so they're not caught off guard when they are supporting or representing the city. So we're in our second phase. The first phase of what we did was really to, much like hopefully everybody does first, what did we do? Or what is AAM? What does this mean for us? So the first thing we did was to really understand what advanced air mobility is and what it is not. It is not George Jetson coming up out of his house and landing in a parking spot at work. It's probably never going to be that. It's definitely not that right now or in the near future. And really understanding what our role is in the regulation of advanced air mobility, what the aircraft can't do, what the most likely things coming into the future are. Also, we conducted an economic impact study. Does it make sense? We didn't know. Does it make sense for the city to construct and operate a vertiport? That was something that our leadership really wanted to understand. And finally, and we also participated in the NASA Community Planning Annex for community integration and provided that local jurisdiction view on how do you integrate a vertiport, and really focused on the vertiport and ground operations into a community. And finally, so important is that stakeholder and regional approach. So what you see on the screen here is from one of our stakeholder meetings. This is by no means scientific, but in partnership with VHB, who's helping lead our planning efforts, we asked everybody in our group, hey, where would you want to go? Just to get a sense from our partners. And you see there's probably a lot of connections that a lot of you probably would want to do or connect to. So there's a strong connection to Tampa, to the coast, to South Florida, to Tallahassee. And then within that, also you can see there's a number, the dots are a little bit more specific on where would a vertiport make sense to you. And a lot of those are near some of our transportation hubs, some of our big attractors like Disney, Universal, the airport, convention center. So not a lot of surprising things here, but it further kind of, it told us, hey, we're on the right path. People do see value in these connections. So for our economic impact analysis, and there's a lot of math and stuff in the background that we have very smart people who understand all of that, but what we did really was, what is the economic impact of a vertiport in our downtown? We chose the Geico Garage. If those of you who aren't familiar with downtown Orlando, it is a parking garage right next to the Amway Center where the Magic play. There's an existing heliport on the rooftop. So we figured, hey, that's an easy place. It can support some kind of operations now. Let's take a look. What does that mean? So with the vertiport, we looked at what are the direct impacts. So capital improvements, direct job creation. What are the impacts to parking revenue? That the rooftop of the garage, we get revenue by people parking there. If you put a vertiport, we're not getting any of that parking revenue. Also, indirect impact, so how does it impact adjacent businesses and activity, as well as some of the induced impacts, the broader response of the economy to the vertiport. So when we looked at it, and for the city, a lot of what we look at is the tax. What are we going to be getting from that tax, that added value? So we saw, likely $2.8 million over 10 years, 4.3 over 20 years. Additionally, money towards Orange County in the form of taxes and different benefits, as well as Florida. So there is a benefit. There's some direct jobs. We anticipated 50 jobs just using a lot of the best. And this is about a year and a half old, so some of this is probably a little outdated, but 50 direct and indirect jobs, 95 within the county. So there are some positive impacts. And we also didn't model some of the other items that really come into this. So one of the big ones is we estimate about $600,000 to $1 million a year in lost revenue for the parking spaces on the garage. We would have to renegotiate an existing parking lease, which is a big liability to have to go through with the Orlando Magic. And really trying to understand, what does a ground lease look like if we did it to with a third party? And altogether, the key takeaways is there's a potential, here the potential cost is an upfront of $30 million with up to $1 million a year in lost revenue, and possible $4.3 million over a 20-year period of money coming back to the city. So it was a pretty clear, doesn't really make sense for the city to make this kind of investment. But it really told us that, or showed that there are some tangible economic benefits. So we're not going to be putting a vertiport on top of the Geico garage, but understanding this, if we do get a partner coming in and wants to go somewhere, we really have a better understanding of what are some of those fundamentals that we need to look at as if we are going to engage in some type of lease. The next phase, which we are currently working through right now, is really looking at zoning and regulations review, really hyper-focused at the city. What changes do we need to make to allow for advanced air mobility in the city, and additional coordination with other agencies as part of that process? So this really dovetails really well into a lot of the work that came out of the FDOT Advanced Air Mobility Working Group. One of the recommended best practices for cities is to review zoning ordinances, because that's how we can say, yes, you can put a vertiport here, or no, it has to go here, and what the considerations are. And right now we have a vertiport approval process in code. It's from the 90s, so definitely a very different kind of aircraft. In consideration, this is probably the most recent vertiport that we have in the city. This is on International Drive, and it is Air Force Fun helicopter tours. So they have 2 helicopters that they utilize this space to take tours of I-4, and I'm hoping they go near Disney and Universal. I-4 is not that exciting, but depends what's going on. Hopefully nobody had fun on I-4 today. So we do have vertiport approvals in our code. It is for this type of use, or more regularly for heliports as part of a hospital or emergency operations. So with that, so Chapter 58, Part 4P has vertiports. It says vertiports in our code. They are only allowed in certain zoning districts and only through a conditional use permit. There's going to be a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to cover every single word, but this was last updated in 1991. A lot has changed since 91, and a lot continues to change. So as we're looking as a city to update our codes, we want to make sure that we are updating because we want to be accommodating to industry, and we want to allow for this innovation to happen, but also we don't want it to happen in an uncontrolled way where we are stuck with the point that, oh, we approved a vertiport, it didn't go so well, but we can't take it back. So you'll see that we reference some great stuff from the 60s in here in our codes. There, might need to look at that. And a lot of what our experience has been, and what you see here, and I think is the case with a lot of places, is there's a little who goes first, where we really look for the FAA to provide some feedback, but I think a lot of times the FAA would like some certainty that the city's generally okay with it. Same thing with our general aviation, GOA, our GOA partner. So it's a lot of who's doing what when. Also, there's a lot of requirements in here that I'd be completely honest, we're not as a city really ready to handle or have a lot of expertise in. So the vertiport is operationally feasible. What does that mean? Me as a city transportation planner, I don't really know what operationally feasible means. The FAA considers the proposed vertiport to be safe and conduct the type and volume of aeronautical activity. We don't have a clear mechanism to have that conversation, and that's something we need to do. The location and specification, okay, that's kind of gets into more of our standard. The fire prevention, that's going to have to be really looked at, and our fire department really getting engaged in what does that fire protection mean, and is it for vertiports, vertistops, where they're going to be charging? Is it a mixed-use facility, so there's traditional aviation and electrical? Air turbulence, if we're putting in vertiports in our downtown, that's a very different look of air turbulence than in, on airport property. Again, this is stuff that the city does not typically get involved in. When we're looking at a new bus line or even autonomous vehicles on the ground, air turbulence does not come into play. And need. That there's a bona fide need for the vertiport. We don't have a set, what does the need mean? So we're having to look at a lot of these definitions and really update. And that public welfare will not be adversely affected. So stuff like that is availability of other vertiports, emergency landing areas, what are, tall buildings, other navigational hazards that would present a public safety hazard, not only existing, but we need to, as a city, understand what are the possibilities. In a lot of these zoning areas, you can put a high rise. So if we approve a vertiport, from the city standpoint, what legal jeopardy or not does that put us in for the property next door? So you put in a vertiport, does that take away, is there an implied taking of property rights next door? So those are some of the legal ramifications that we haven't had to deal with that we really need to start understanding. For those of you that are not really in understanding of what a typical conditional use permit process is, I'll go through and let's try 2 sentences. You submit an application, it gets accepted or rejected by a planning department. It usually goes to some type of planning board, and then the city council, county commission approve those recommendations. So it is a very public process. Notifications go out to neighbors. It is appealable through a couple different legal aspects, but it is a very set process that most cities and counties have for those types of uses. For us, it's the same process if you want to put in a McDonald's or if you want to do a vertiport or a car wash, it's the same conditional use permit process. Should it be? Maybe not, and that's what we need to look at. Also, the City of Orlando allows vertiports in these zoning districts through the conditional use permit, which is a lot of our mixed use and commercial areas of the city. Does it make sense for them to be in all these areas? Probably not, but it is something that people can apply for. So a big part, just going back to the need to collaborate, we have, because these other folks here that you see, folks like Metroplan, FDOT, GOA, Sanford, even Space Florida, they have a lot of the technical expertise and knowledge that we as a city don't have. And we can lean on them and get them into the conversation about looking at airspace, looking at aircraft, and understanding for some of these are going to be great connections. So having them as part of that conversation, how can we enable some of those connections? And how do we really think through some of those implications has been really, really helpful. These are some of the key questions that really affect what we're looking at. So, and I know that Qatar has been doing a lot of work on where should vertiports be located, and there's a lot of discussion on that. Who owns and operates the vertiport? Is it a public use vertiport? Is it a private vertiport? How do we ensure safe operations and integrations into existing airspace? From the city perspective, we don't want to get too much into airspace. That is, our view is there should be a unified set of rules across jurisdictional boundaries. If you look at our map, let's see here, this is just kind of representative. The city boundaries it is not a nice square, it's not a nice circle, it's jagged all over the place. So aircraft consistently go between jurisdictions. Another question is, what happens when we move out of the regulatory phase where we're kind of thinking through initial operations into the larger phase, into higher operations? How do we do that in a way that is allows the industry to flourish, but not in a way that allows unfettered development. Also, really for us, is a big one is how do we regulate operations at a vertiport? I've heard a lot of very interesting ideas, such as, just have a maximum decibels throughout the day. Okay, well, what happens when that max gets hit? Are all other flights canceled? How does the city monitor that? How do we enforce that? Any regulations that a city has, whether it's noise or access, we have to be able to regulate as well as code enforce. Nobody loves code enforcement, but we have to be able to have a way to regulate and monitor. And then also, as I mentioned before, how does a vertiport approval affect neighboring properties, their rights for development? That's something that we have not, from a vertiport standpoint, really had to deal with. But if we're looking in the long run of having vertiports more in dense urban environments, you can see how that very quickly, the approval of a vertiport can affect adjacent properties. So we're looking at the whole ecosystem. So we're working with our theme parks, the Orlando Economic Partnership from the jobs and that side of things, as well as Central Florida has a lot of simulation and training. How do we look at clean energy as well as advanced manufacturing to move the whole, it's not just the vertiports, but the whole ecosystem forward? Part of that is the NASA partnership that I mentioned before. And what I think is really great from our standpoint, as a city, there's a lot of technical knowledge out there, but these are some really good resources that we've either been a part of or have taken value from. So NASA came up with the Community Integration Considerations Playbook, which was published just a few weeks ago, I think. FDOT had the working group that came up with a lot of really good recommendations for both cities, state, and what we may be looking for from FAA. The American Planning Association is working on a Planning for AAM guidebook, which will help local municipalities of knowing what the right questions are, what the right steps in this are to take. The Transportation Research Board has new users of shared airspace with a lot of publications, even for this upcoming year's TRB conference, on things like mode shift and a lot of similar work to what Qatar is doing. And then there's a big push at a lot of conferences on vertiports and really the community integration side of things. So how do you get it into the community in a way that's good for the community and doesn't negatively impact the community? So there's a lot of resources. Sometimes it feels like too many, but there's a lot of really good resources out there. And thank you.